These are your cell respiration video notes. So cell respiration takes in three major things. So we have glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. So first up, and you should note as we go through this video, the titles of the slides are at the bottom. So who does cell respiration? Animals. Plants do it a little bit, but in terms of this class, we're mainly going to talk about animals doing cell respiration. So we take in oxygen and we release carbon dioxide. So we just finished talking about plants, which take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen as a byproduct. So what are heterotrophs? So heterotrophs are things that have to get their food, which hopefully you remember from ecology in middle school. But this means we have to take in food. So where does our glucose come from? Our food. So even though maybe you don't eat much plant like lettuce and vegetables and things like that, you're eating meat that has eaten plants. So you're still technically getting that glucose from the plants, just indirectly. So glucose is in our food, and our cells take the electrons, which you should know are little E- and they're negatively charged, from glucose by breaking it down and making ATP. So if you remember, ATP is a source of energy. So this is like your little Red Bull or your power bar. Something that gives you a burst of energy, and you have tons of ATP that your body uses to function. So what about metabolism? This is a word that hopefully you've heard before. So metabolism is your ability to break down glucose and produce ATP as a source of energy. So some people have a faster metabolism, meaning they do what? They eat more. So people with a faster metabolism can eat a ton of food and they never gain weight because their body breaks down that glucose and produces ATP at a very fast rate. But the question is, do we use all this ATP we produce at one time? The answer is no. Because how often do we need to eat? Do you eat every 20 minutes? No. Well, some of you might, but naturally you don't. What we do is we store ATP. So once we make it, we store it, and then our body is able to use it all the time. That's why you can keep breathing and your heart keeps beating and everything keeps working when you're sleeping or when you're resting. So cell respiration overview. Now this diagram's a little bit more complicated than photosynthesis, but hopefully it's not too bad. And we'll do the same activity in class to work through it. But here we go. So glycolysis is the first part of cell respiration. So here's your glucose, and it takes ATP to make this work. So it takes 2 ATP. And we talked about this before. To use the energy from ATP, you turn it into ADP, which means diphosphate. So at the end of glycolysis, we produce 2, they're called pyruvates. Basically, really general, you need to know that they're 3 carbon compounds. These dots are each a carbon. So each of them have 3. Okay? And as a result, we produce 4 ATP. But technically, our net only equals 2 because it took 2 to do. So 2 of these will go back and fuel it again, and 2 of them continue on to the next step. So here's it in words. Glucose enters the cell from our food source, like we said. 2 ATP are needed to fuel it. And then the glucose splits into 2 3-carbon compounds. They convert into that word pyruvate I said, and 4 ATP are released. Now 2 ATP are going to go back for the next thing of glucose, and 2 ATP go on to the next step. So here's that diagram again. If I were you, I would pause the video and sit here and kind of study it. Make sure you understand big picture. So you want to understand glucose, that it makes a pyruvate, or 2 of them actually. 2 ATP go in, 4 ATP come out. So next, I just want to go over the basic structure of a mitochondria. So you have your cristae, which are these parts here. It kind of looks like old caves that you might walk through. You have an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And then you have the matrix, which is this area in here. This inner membrane space is, yes, a part, but we really won't talk about it. So next you have Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is the most complex cycle. We're not going to get into it a lot like you might in honors or AP bio, so don't worry. It's not going to be that difficult. But here's a picture with the overview. And now we'll look at the words. So we have when oxygen is present, so oxygen has to be there. Pyruvate goes into the matrix. So we just talked about where the matrix of the mitochondria is. It combines with something called CoA. And it makes citric acid. Okay? Krebs cycles, also known as citric acid cycle. Okay? So the citric acid cycles and it releases your carbon dioxide and it makes ATP. So this is where our waste that we breathe out is formed. And then the ATP goes on to the next step. So let's look back at this picture. So your CoA comes in. CoA comes in. It's going to go through the circle, okay? You have CO2 given off, CO2 given off, ATP given off. Now, FADH2 and NADH are also given off. The only thing you need to know about them is they are electron carriers. The next thing is the electron transport chain. So it requires electron carriers to move those electrons. So last then is your electron transport chain. Now this has lots of complexes and it shows all this crazy stuff. I just want you to know, big picture, this is the membrane of the mitochondria. Okay, this is the membrane of the mitochondria. Stuff has to exit, right? So think about it. Glycolysis takes place outside and Krebs cycle takes place inside. So the electrons have to move out and so does the ATP. So your H plus ions, which are hydrogen, hopefully you remember that, are released into the intermembrane space. So that's that space. Later, they're pumped through ATP synthase, which creates ATP. So this creates way more ATP. And big thing you need to know, just big picture, most of the ATP is produced in the electron transport chain. So almost all of the ATP is produced here. So the electron transport chain is extremely important to this process. So let's look at it again. So this is your ATP synthase. This is what pumps hydrogen ions. And it makes ADP, eventually becomes a different color, ATP. And this is outside. Okay? So, big picture takeaway, glucose molecule is going to make around 36. It can also make 38. So either one of those answers would be correct. And then fermentation is our last thing here. So fermentation is if there's no oxygen. This is maybe if you're sprinting or doing like heavy lifting and you're not breathing, your body will go into fermentation. So there's no oxygen here if we look at this picture. So you don't have any oxygen. So this pyruvate you make goes up here and goes through fermentation. And depending on who you are, so if you're a yeast cell, you're doing ethanol or alcohol fermentation. And if you're a muscle cell, like if you're in the gym, you're doing lactic acid fermentation, which is also where you get that lactic acid buildup. So why do we even do fermentation? Glycolysis only produces that 2-ATP, and it has a limited amount of NAD+, which is what we need to do glycolysis. So if this is used up, we don't have a way of regenerating it unless the cell does fermentation. So sometimes the cell will do fermentation just to replenish this NADP+. So, right here, main point of fermentation, regenerate NAD+. okay? And it also does produce some ATP, not enough for your body to function. So this is an anaerobic, meaning no oxygen. So aerobic process is with oxygen. Anaerobic means no oxygen. And there's two types. So like I said, you have lactic acid and alcohol. Alcohol is yeast. Lactic acid is your muscles. Okay? If no oxygen is present, but the cell needs to generate this NADP plus and ATP, the pyruvate will begin fermentation. And this is also, like I said, where the lactic acid builds up in your muscles. That's where you get that from. So one last look here. It's going to go through glycolysis no matter what. Makes this pyruvate. If there's no oxygen and you're doing some heavy workout, it's going to go up here. Okay? Then your muscle cells are going to make lactate or lactic acid. And this here shows the regeneration. So NAD plus goes into this cycle making NADH. But the NADH will regenerate into this NAD plus, which we need to function. So that is cell respiration in a nutshell.